Hi, everyone, and welcome to Voices of West Windsor. My name is Paul Egedy. I'm the head archivist of the Historical Society of West Windsor. And this week I have Adena Blum, Rabbi of Beth Chaim, with me. So welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So just to get right into it, I think the appropriate thing to start would be to talk about the history of Beth Chaim. So I'm wondering, I know that the Beth Chaim's website has a whole history written about it, but for the purpose of the viewers of this interview, and for what you might want to highlight, can you talk a little bit about the history?
Absolutely. We're actually about to celebrate our 50th anniversary next year.
Mm-hmm.
We first started out in members' homes. It was several families who got together and said, we want to give our kids a Jewish education. And the only synagogue in the area at that time was Beth El Synagogue, which identified as conservative. And I believe at that time was located in Heightstown. There was a growing Jewish population in Twin Rivers in East Windsor. And those families were looking for a home that matched more of their Reform Jewish values, and so created Beth Chaim from scratch. When they first went to a facility outside of the home, they rented space in St. Paul's Lutheran Church in East Windsor. And then when it was time for them to establish their own home, they came here to West Windsor in the building that we're in now, although it was much smaller then. And I'm not remembering the year. I believe it was in the 70s, but there wasn't much else in our neck of the woods. And the synagogue was jokingly called the Little Shul on the Prairie, shul meaning synagogue. The schools that are now surrounding our campus were not there. And so it was mostly farmland around the facility of the synagogue. And it was a much smaller building at the time. And we have since had 2 expansions so that to accommodate our growing congregation between our first move here in the 70s. Or even maybe around 1980 until about, I would say 2005, even 2010. And now our community has been shrinking. We're seeing that the demographics in West Windsor and environs have changed, and more young Jewish families are, at least until COVID, were staying in the cities longer and more interested in being in suburbs a little closer to the main metropolitan hubs. Since COVID, we're actually seeing a reversal of that trend, more people trying to get out of the cities and away from the more congested areas. And West Windsor is really primed because we are on the train line right into Manhattan and easily not too far from Philadelphia as well. So now we're seeing some of younger families who are looking to get more into a more comfortable area in light of the pandemic.
Now, you mentioned that there were some expansions done to the building itself. Are there any other notable specific events that you either recall in your service or that you know of at Beth Chaim that you think stand out, particularly in that half century of history?
In addition to the expansions of the building?
Yeah.
Nothing that's striking my mind at the moment. I do know that it was important for us to start our preschool program, and that was really in response to the number of young Jewish families who are looking to start their Jewish education for their children even younger than kindergarten. And we had a Jewish community center locally that it's been a number of years since we had that. And the Jewish Community Center, when I was growing up in Lawrenceville, was located in Ewing. So even if, they had a preschool program, folks in West Windsor weren't going to that location to send their children. So I know that really transformed our community. And since I have joined Beth Chaim, I'm now in my 7th year, I've unfortunately seen other Jewish preschools in our area close. Our local synagogues, almost all of them had one, and now we're the last remaining preschool. So I know that that's been an important piece of our synagogue history. Also, we've had a lot of longevity at the congregation. My my long-term predecessor was Rabbi Eric Wisnia, who was here for 42 years. And so his retirement actually is a really important milestone in our synagogue's history. We did have rabbinic leadership before him. I believe he was the fifth rabbinic leader of our congregation, but because he was the leader for so long, especially given how young we are as a synagogue, his retirement, I believe it's now 2 years ago, was a huge milestone. And I was originally the assistant rabbi. And now that I'm the senior or solo rabbi of the congregation, we don't have a second rabbi now. That's a shift for our congregation as well. It also demonstrates that we are a smaller synagogue, but also we're heading into a new chapter of our leadership and our time at Beth Chaim.
Now, you mentioned that the congregation is actually shrinking a bit because of people generally moving to the cities or near to the cities. When did that start? How long has that been going on? Is there like a significant that you saw, or is it just more of a slow trend? Or
I would say it's been about 10 years now that we've noticed a significant trend. Every year that I've been here, we've had about a net loss of about 50 families. So I think that's really telling in how much the area has changed in the last 10 years alone.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then I guess to you, what makes Beth Chaim unique? I guess obviously you're there for a reason. What about its operations and community particularly stand out to you?
So Beth Chaim is a Reform congregation, like I mentioned earlier. We identify with the Union for Reform Judaism, which is a denomination throughout the US and Canada. There's also Reform Jews throughout the world, but we are unique in that, our closest synagogue neighbor, Bethel, they're conservative. So we have a different theological outlook, a different outlook on Jewish practice. And so if you identify as Reform and you live on this side of Route 1, and we can talk about that dynamic as well, this will be more likely the home that you would seek, at least at first. But what I really love about Beth Chaim is, yes, we're still the largest congregation in our area, but we're very down to earth. And we really put a high priority on being warm and welcoming and trying very hard to reinforce that culture. And so we want folks to feel like our doors are always open. And even if we are on the larger side, that everyone can sort of find their home here at Beth Chaim and also find their voice and a way to get involved. And I'm really proud of all the different ways that people can intersect with the synagogue. It's not just about Jewish education or about worship, but it's also about social action. And it's about learning for people of all ages and stages.
Actually, that what you said actually sparked two new questions for me. I guess the first one would be, you mentioned this side of Route 1. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So I grew up in Lawrenceville. So I lived on the other side of Route 1. And, in preparation for today's interview, I was thinking about, growing up, how did I approach the Windsors at all? It was so rare that I ever went to East Windsor, and West Windsor was really where my doctors were. I had a pediatrician with an office on this side and my orthodontist. And I did have some friends, especially in high school, who went to West Windsor Plainsboro High School, but I really didn't cross Route 1 very much. I was always, going to Princeton, hanging out in Lawrenceville. And now that I'm a rabbi in the community, I'm seeing how that Route 1 divide is playing out in the local Jewish community, that generally folks like to stay on this side for Jewish programming. So if our board of rabbis, which does straddle Route 1 throughout Mercer County, we find that we'll get a higher percentage of participants in in-person programming if the location is on their side of Route 1. So, Bethel and Beth Chaim, we see a lot of the same folks often, and Adith Israel, Har Sinai, and the Jewish Center in Princeton, they often may see some overlap in participation. And there are folks who absolutely will cross to participate in Jewish life. For example, we do have members who live in Lawrenceville, in Princeton, in Pennington. But there is this perception that to cross Route 1 is, I got to cross Route 1 today, or it's like a big to do. Sure. And really trying to bridge the communities together, especially as our overall Jewish community is shrinking. We're having community conversations about how we can partner better together.
I was actually going to ask. I know this is not technically on the list of questions that I sent you previously, but how are the different congregations currently coordinating?
Mhm. We have a couple of organizations that enable sort of a cross-synagogue relationship,
Mhm.
mostly born out of our local federation. This is the Federation of Princeton Mercer Bucks, or the Jewish Federation of Princeton Mercer Bucks. The
Mhm.
reason that we have such a long name is because they used to be three independent Jewish federations who have merged over time as the community has shrunk. So there was a time where we were very involved with the Jewish community just over the river in Bucks County, not further in. For example, I grew up at Har Sinai Temple, which when it was in Trenton had a huge population of folks who lived in Yardley, Pennsylvania. Since Har Sinai moved to Pennington, it's become a lot less of that, and we don't see our colleagues or congregations in Pennsylvania very often anymore, and it's really much more of a greater Mercer County community.
Mhm.
But that federation does serve all the Jewish communities in those areas. Princeton had its own federation, so even though it's in Mercer County, it wasn't part of the Mercer County Federation until all of those mergers took place. And then offshoots or partner organizations with the federation include Jewish Family and Children's Services, who who provide really much needed services, feeding the hungry, clinical services, providing clothes and other amenities throughout Mercer County and also into Bucks County. And we're working on what to do with Middlesex County and Monmouth County, for example, because I have members in all of those places. Actually, and I do have some members in Bucks County as well. And then we also have our local board of rabbis, and that's headed by the rabbis in all of the synagogues in Mercer County. So Adith
Mhm.
Israel, Sinai, the Jewish Center, Bethel, and Beth Chaim. We are trying to partner with some of the Chabads in our area, but at this time they're not interested in participating on the clergy level, and so we don't have as much coordination with those communities.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's actually not really nice to hear. I mean, it's obvious that it would happen, but it was still nice to hear about the the donation of food, and I think you said clothing. That's really nice. And then the other thing that you brought up a few minutes ago was I think social activism.
Social activism
Speak a
or
little bit
social
about that.
justice.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Especially at this time in the life of our country and our world, we're seeing a lot more community conversations about social action and social justice.
Mhm.
Beth Chaim has always cared very deeply about this value in Jewish life, longstanding value to seek justice and do justice and take care of those in need. The way it's looked for many years at Beth Chaim has often been to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. This is some language from our liturgy. And we have a social action committee here at Congregation Beth Chaim that's had long-standing drives and donations that help local communities in the area, not only Jewish Family and Children's Services, but also Homefront and Mercer Street Friends, to name a few. Those are our biggest partner organizations. But now we're also looking into racial justice. And for example, there is a conversation tomorrow night happening with the Windsor Heightstown Area Ministerium, which is an interfaith coalition. I'm a past president of this organization that draws from houses of worship in both Windsors and the Heightstown area. And we dabble a little bit into Plainsboro, Cranberry, and Hamilton as well. And we're having a town hall meeting tomorrow night to talk about predominantly racial justice issues in our community, but any other issues that people want to bring up, and inviting our local elected officials to be present and sort of hear what some of the concerns and questions are right in our backyard. So so that's a sense of what's going on right now. I'm finding that it's coming in waves, that there are the consistent programs and projects that we do. Like we always are doing a food drive around Thanksgiving and the holiday of Passover, but the local sort of activism and advocacy pieces are coming in waves and very much in tune to what's going on statewide and nationally.
Mm-hmm. And actually, that's a perfect transition to I guess the next question is there either or a few national events that have particularly either draw notice or affected Beth Chaim?
Absolutely. So the first time that the Black Lives Matter movement arose about 5 years ago, I know I, as a rabbi, was really interested in seeing what was going on in the national level, and we started having conversations about race and privilege here at Beth Chaim, and then the news cycle shifted, and different elements were taking priority both nationally, but also here. And now with George Floyd's murder in May, no, it's very hard for any of our local houses of worship to ignore this question of race in America, and we're seeing a renewed response to that, national piece of news. And also, what's going on with our election cycle has spurred a lot of conversation in our community. We have a number of people in our community trying to get the vote out, telling people to vote their values. Yeah, these are some of the hot button issues that have really sparked of conversation, not just at Beth Chaim, but in the Windsors and beyond.
Yeah. Now that actually, again, yet another good transition, because a lot of this is about more than religion. Where do you see, because recently we talked with the Muslim Center of Greater Princeton, with a member from the Muslim Center, and he mentioned to me, he kept stressing how the Muslim Center was much more than a religious center, it was also a community center. And that he actually argued that, I believe he argued that the Muslim Center was more community center than it was a religious center. Where do you see Beth Chaim falling along that spectrum?
What a great question. Also, just as a point of reference, we've been partnering with the Muslim Center of Greater Princeton for many years. We helped support them when they were trying to build their mosque. So that's a community that we have a really positive relationship with. And I've seen their facility and seen how much they built a building to reflect the kind of community center they wanted to be. Historically, Beth Chaim was a synagogue, and both a house of worship, but also a house of education, especially since the Jewish Community Center ceased to be in our backyard. We've been having community conversations of who might be able to fill that void. And we're seeing the Jewish Community Center Day Camp is really trying to step in and use their facility to fulfill some of the roles of a Jewish community center, but also as the largest synagogue in our area who has a facility that could lend itself. We've been having a lot of conversations about Chaim. What would it look like if we became a Jewish community center as well? And so we've had a number of initiatives in recent years about trying to expand our offerings at Beth Chaim. We have, for example, we have a task force committed to mind, body, and soul, and incorporating meditation and yoga, all within a Jewish framework, but sort of expanding what our offerings are to meet other needs in our community. We have, before COVID, we have a beautiful playground that we use for the preschool during the school week, but how could we open that up maybe on the weekends, for example? Of course, COVID has thrown a wrench in everybody's works, but yes, we are exploring ways that we can be expand what we do to also be a community center in a different sense.
Yeah, no, I actually interesting. I used to go to preschool at Beth Chaim, at this 22, 23, 25 years ago, whatever,
Fabulous.
however old I was. Yeah.
Right.
So I remember that. If you're talking about the same playground, I kind of remember it.
It's probably very similar.
Yeah. Now so tying back to to something you said about how you worked to help the Muslim Center open their doors in West Windsor. What other interfaith coordination does the Beth Chaim community engage in?
So it's very interesting. So I'm part of several formal interfaith organizations. I already spoke about WHAM, the Windsor Heights-Town Area Ministerium, where I'm a recent past president. I'm also involved in the Religious Leaders of West Windsor, which was an organization by another name that Mayor Xing-Fu had established probably 8 or 9 years ago. And it has evolved since then, but that is really just for religious leaders in West Windsor and is not only a clergy organization. So I've gotten to know some of our local lay leaders in a beautiful way. That's how I've been able to build a really nice relationship with our Chief of Police, Rob Garofalo. I'm also starting to get involved in the religious leaders of Robbinsville as I recently moved there in February, and figuring out how we can partner with those local houses of worship that I did not really know anything about before I moved there. We partner with the local mosque. They annually have had an interfaith Thanksgiving luncheon that has been really important to Beth Chaim members to show up and participate, and to show the solidarity that we have with our Muslim brothers and sisters. And those are the formal opportunities. We've been talking, especially among WAM, with several, which is a clergy only organization. We've identified lay leaders who want to do more interfaith work and what that could look like. So we've been talking about doing a worship hop where we, a group of folks, visits different houses of worship every month to learn about their traditions and their practices, and then bring that back to our communities. We've talked about doing book clubs. Unfortunately, again, some of the momentum from these initiatives has been detracted, but we're hoping to get back to that soon.
Now, obviously, I would say, so you alluding to COVID is again another good transition. How have the operations changed during COVID, and have there been any community members of Beth Chaim that have particularly stepped up to the plate in terms of bringing the community together? Because I would assume that just like most other community organizations, COVID has kind of dissipated a lot of activities.
So the good news is we never stopped overall operations, but we did move online only from mid-March through July 4th. Shortly after July 4th, we did reopen our preschool. And that was because it was finally possible for us to do so, according to the governor of New Jersey. And we did have a 6-week summer camp program for our preschool that was really successful. And we have really strict protocols in place, all within the state guidelines, but actually exceeding those guidelines. And that was really huge. And our first step to sort of getting back to an in-person operations model. We were hosting online services every single week from the moment that the building closed. Now we're dabbling with in-person outdoor services, outdoors because singing is so incredibly fraught for the transmission of the virus. And we're going to start to have conversations of what would an in-person in the building experience look like. Staff have been back in the building since July. We all have our own spaces, and when we're not in our own spaces, we're masked. I really have to give huge thank you to our lay leadership, our temple board, who has tried to respond as nimbly as possible to all of the changing variables. The news, especially around COVID, is you get something new every 5 minutes. It's luckily just that has slowed down a little bit, for which I'm very grateful. But as new executive orders come out from the governor, and new lists of what states are on the travel advisory list, all those kinds of things, we have protocols in place and trying to keep those nimble. For example, now to come in the building, you have to have your temperature checked, sign in for contact tracing, but the system is working and people are really, really grateful to have the opportunity to come back in the building. And we do now have congregants back in limited ways, so that they can reconnect with their community, because especially for our less technologically savvy members, they were feeling really lonely and isolated for quite some time. So having these touch points in person has been really important.
Actually, that last thing that you mentioned to me brings up a question that, again, I don't think I sent you before, but I think would be interesting. Are there any members that have been with you since the very beginning, since the entire 50 years?
Yeah, so we have a few founding members who are still with us. A number of them have passed, and some have moved away. And so, generally the folks who've moved away still keep an affiliation one way or another, or at least a connection to our congregation. We have a small number of founding members still with us, and I'm actually partnering with them to gather history for Beth Chaim as we're preparing for our 50th anniversary.
Oh, that's perfect. That's great. So I guess the best way to end this off would be for a twofold question. First one is, has there been anyone in Beth Chaim that has particularly inspired you, either Beth Chaim or the surrounding community? And then number two is, where do you see, since West Windsor has grown immensely in the last like 40 years. It's more than tripled in population, and just its identity is completely changed. And with that, I have to assume that the community that comes into Beth Chaim has changed somewhat as well, at the very least. Where do you see Beth Chaim in the next few years?
Great questions. I'm really indebted to Rabbi Eric Wisnia for how he really grew this congregation from a relatively small coalition of families to, at its height, an over 800 family congregation. And he really saw that our building expanded as the community expanded, and really was a very strong presence in the Windsor community, and had really incredible relationships. And so I'm indebted to everything that he has built and created, and trying to imagine what the next chapter is going to look like. We are hoping that Beth Chaim will continue to be a Jewish community center for the folks who live in our area. We really hope that we can maintain our preschool. As I said, it's the remaining Jewish preschool in our area. And so we are engaging families from the surrounding area who may not choose to affiliate with Congregation Beth Chaim as a synagogue down the road, but really are grateful to have had that Jewish anchor for their youngest children. And really, we're working now to use technology to our advantage. We already were having these conversations before COVID. The pandemic threw us into the deep end on this. How do we meet people where they're at? And what's beautiful about Zoom is you can easily click the record button, and if I missed the class or the meeting earlier that day or that evening, I could always watch it later. For example, our High Holy Day services were almost entirely pre-recorded, and everything was live streamed. So anyone could watch all of our High Holy Day services today for everything that took place over the last 2 weeks. And we are hearing from folks who said that they missed it on the day of for whatever reason, and are so grateful to have that chance to sort of reconnect with their community. We are using a hybrid model. Well, hybrid's not fair. We have an in-person model for religious school and a Zoom model for religious school to try to meet the needs of different parents. What that's teaching us is, what do we do for folks for whom the time that we have set for religious school is no longer going to work for them? How can we use technology to get their kids the education that they need, but work with their increasingly hectic and busy schedules? So, I'm hoping that with new technological tools, we have a new executive director who has a marketing acumen. We can sort of get the word out about Beth Chaim and let people know that there's more than one way to engage, that we're a warm and welcoming community. And even if overall we're shrinking, how can we remain strong and keep true to our core values?
Okay, well, great. Well, again, thank you very much for joining me in this segment of Voices of West Windsor, and I appreciate you taking your time out of your day to join.
Thank you for having me again. It's really an honor to be part of this project.